What happens when a millionaire loses his sight, is betrayed by the woman he loves, and finds hope in the most unexpected place? Daniel Hayes had it all, until he lost everything. But one woman, with a heart full of light, walked into his darkness and changed everything. This is a story of pain, love, and powerful redemption. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. It had been raining for days in Seattle, and the sky looked like it hadn't seen the sun in a decade. But that morning, it wasn't the weather that weighed Daniel Hayes down. It was the silence. A silence so thick, so permanent, it became a part of him. He sat on the edge of his massive bed, one hand gripping the duvet, the other resting on the polished wood of the nightstand, where he knew, by feel, a bottle of painkillers and his watch still sat untouched. Daniel hadn't seen a sunrise in almost 5 months. Once a household name in the tech world, Daniel had founded a billion-dollar software company before turning 35. He had graced magazine covers, given keynote speeches, and built an empire in a glass tower overlooking downtown. People said he had the golden touch. Everything he built turned to profit. But all that power, all that precision, had vanished the moment his helicopter went down in the Cascades. The engine had failed mid-flight. The pilot died instantly. Daniel had lived. Some called it a miracle. But what he got in return wasn't life. It was darkness. Permanent, blinding darkness. He had woken up in the hospital 2 days later. At first, he thought it was the morphine, the bandages. He waited for clarity that never came. When the doctor said the words, "irreversible optic nerve damage," they sounded like someone else's death sentence. Vanessa, his wife of 17 years, had squeezed his hand. But she hadn't said much. In fact, she said less and less as the days went on. And now she hardly spoke at all. Daniel heard her that morning. He could always tell when she walked in. The sharp click of her designer heels against the imported marble floors. The brief hesitation at the threshold like she was deciding if it was even worth coming in. She didn't greet him. No good morning, no kiss on the cheek. Just the soft rustle of a purse being set down on the kitchen island 20 feet away. "Have you taken your medication?" she asked. Her tone wasn't warm. It was more like a nurse in a hurry. Daniel nodded. He didn't have the energy to speak. Truthfully, he hadn't taken anything. He couldn't remember if it was morning or night. Time had melted into one long stretch of nothingness. Vanessa didn't come over. She didn't ask how he was, didn't offer to sit beside him. Instead, she sighed. An exasperated exhale that told him she was tired of being there. Moments later, she left. The click-clack of her heels grew fainter, then the soft swoosh of the door closing. He was alone again, and he hated it. The house was a museum of what life used to be. Floor-to-ceiling windows, state-of-the-art sound system, a gym he could no longer use, a grand piano he couldn't play. He used to throw parties in that house. People laughed, music played, glasses clinked with champagne and expensive whiskey. Now, the silence screamed louder than a crowd ever could. He dragged himself to the living room and sat in the leather armchair by the fireplace. Not that he could see the flames anymore, but he remembered the way they used to flicker against the stone walls. He remembered how Vanessa used to curl up on the rug in front of it, drinking wine and reading fashion magazines. Back then, she loved him. Or at least, she loved being married to a man who could give her anything. That version of him was gone. His fingers drifted to the side of the chair, feeling the grooves in the leather. He imagined what he must look like now: disheveled beard, uncombed hair, baggy sweatpants. A man who once ran multi-million-dollar meetings now struggled to open a bottle of water. The thought made him laugh, bitterly. Then came the moment that broke whatever was left of his spirit. That afternoon, Daniel was making his way upstairs when he heard Vanessa's voice from the office down the hall. The door was slightly ajar. He paused, hand on the railing, listening. She was on the phone. Her voice was light, playful, the kind of voice she hadn't used with him in years. "Yes, baby. No, he doesn't suspect a thing. Honestly, he's like a ghost now, blind, bitter, and completely checked out. Yes, I'll be out of here soon. Just a few more days." Daniel froze. Every word hit like a punch. He gripped the handrail so tight, his knuckles turned white. "I'm serious," Vanessa continued. "Once I'm done with this, we'll have everything. The lawyers will think he's incompetent. And I'm the patient, grieving wife." Her laugh, light, cruel, careless, echoed in Daniel's head even after she hung up. He stood there for several minutes, trying to process what he'd just heard. Betrayal wasn't new in his world. He had lost friends to greed, been stabbed in the back by board members. But this was different. This was the woman he had once loved more than anything. This was the person who held his hand in the ICU and swore she'd never leave. And she was leaving. Not just leaving, planning it, enjoying it. That night she made up a story about going to visit her mother in San Francisco. She left with a single suitcase, didn't even hug him goodbye. And that was it. She never came back. Daniel didn't cry. He couldn't. Something inside him had already gone numb. He sat on the floor of his bedroom, legs crossed like a child, listening to the quiet that followed her departure. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps fading. It was the sound of everything else disappearing too. The next few weeks were a blur. He stopped eating regularly, barely slept. His beard grew wild. His hair curled at the ends like it used to in college. He didn't shave, didn't want to. He spent most of his time in that same leather chair, fingers running across the smooth surface over and over, as if searching for something he had lost. His mansion became a prison of memories. The staff didn't know what to do. Margaret, his mother, came by more often, trying to pull him out of the darkness with homemade soup and tough love. But Daniel was unreachable. He was locked inside himself, a man with too much money and nothing left to live for. And the worst part? No one could touch the pain. Not even his mother. Margaret tried reasoning. She tried yelling. She even tried dragging him to therapy, but he wouldn't budge. One evening, after a particularly heartbreaking visit, she sat in her car outside the mansion and cried. Her son was slipping away, and she didn't know how to save him. That's when she made a phone call. To a small agency in the city she had heard about from a friend. Not a fancy one, not the kind that catered to millionaires, but one that specialized in long-term care, in emotional healing, in people with soul. "I need someone who's not afraid of a broken man," she said into the phone. "Someone who'll see past the money, the house, the darkness. I need someone who'll fight for him when he doesn't want to fight for himself." The voice on the other end paused, then responded. "We might have just the right person." The next morning, Daniel sat in the living room, unaware of the shift coming. Rain tapped against the windows. A storm gathered in the distance. He was drinking lukewarm coffee he didn't remember making, lost in thought, when he heard the front door open. "Mr. Hayes?" It was his mother. He didn't respond. "I brought someone. She's here to help." He said nothing. Another nurse, another stranger. They always came with the same soft voice and fake sympathy. He had sent the last three away without even hearing their names. Then came a second voice. The knock on the door came at 9:07 a.m., sharp and deliberate. Daniel didn't move. He sat in his leather armchair by the floor-to-ceiling window that once offered a panoramic view of Puget Sound. Now it was just a cold panel of glass that let in light he could no longer see. He turned his face slightly in the direction of the sound, but said nothing. Margaret, his mother, answered the door with the same military precision she applied to everything in life, including raising a son who had once conquered Silicon Valley. The voice that floated into the house was gentle but carried strength beneath it, like velvet wrapped around steel. "Hi, I'm Emily Torres. Margaret said to be here at 9. Daniel let out a breath through his nose. So, this was the new caretaker. He braced himself for the inevitable. Overly cheerful optimism, pity dressed up as professionalism, the awkward hesitations people always had around blind people. He hated it. Hated needing help. Hated having to be managed. He listened to the low murmur of voices and the sound of her shoes on the marble floor. Soft soles, not the typical clacking of someone trying too hard to be important. That was new. Margaret's voice followed. "He's in the sunroom, just follow the hallway and take a left. I'll be in the kitchen." Daniel stiffened. The footsteps approached. He smelled something before he heard her voice again. Cinnamon, sugar, and something warm and homemade. "Hi, Mr. Hayes," she said. Her voice wasn't overly sweet or false. It was simple, kind. "I brought banana bread. I make it when I'm nervous. And I figured first days call for carbs." Daniel didn't turn toward her. "I don't eat carbs," he said flatly. There was a pause, just a heartbeat. Then a laugh. Not a polite giggle, but an actual laugh. Unexpected, amused. "Well," she said, "that's a shame. This banana bread's practically therapy in life form." Against his will, the corner of Daniel's mouth twitched. She didn't push conversation after that. She didn't rattle off her qualifications or try to make small talk. She just placed the plate somewhere nearby. He could hear the soft clink of ceramic on the coffee table, and then busied herself quietly with something he couldn't see. Probably organizing. They always started with organizing, as if stacking books and wiping down counters would somehow fix him. He expected her to ask questions, to try and draw him out, but Emily Torres didn't seem to follow any of the rules he was used to. She hummed while she moved around, not loud, just enough that he could make out the tune. Something old. Billie Holiday, maybe. Around noon, he heard the clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen. Margaret had probably retired to her room, which meant the humming had shifted from background noise to something more personal, more present. Emily reappeared an hour later. "There's soup on the stove. I didn't want to assume, so I made a small batch. Tomato basil." "I'm not hungry." "Totally fair," she said. "I'll leave it on the warmer in case that changes." She paused. He could sense her considering something, then deciding against it. Then, "Do you like music, Mr. Hayes?" "Daniel," he said automatically. "And not really, even before." He tensed. She caught it. "Sorry, none of my business. I'll be in the study if you need anything." Silence again. Except it wasn't empty this time. It carried her scent, coffee and citrus, and her presence, which felt like sunlight seeping under a locked door. That night, after she'd gone home, Daniel sat in the dark with the untouched plate of banana bread and sniffed it like a man starved for something he couldn't name. The next morning she was back, on time, always quiet, but never tiptoeing. "I'm going to open the windows," she announced. "This place feels like a tomb." "It is a tomb," Daniel muttered. "Well," she said, "I brought incense. Hope you don't mind sandalwood?" "I do." She laughed again. "Too bad. It's all I had." Over the next few days she kept showing up. She brought different breads, lemon poppy seed, pumpkin, even cornbread once, and never asked why he wouldn't eat them. She read aloud while cleaning, told stories about her life, how her neighbor's dog chewed up her shoes, how the washing machine flooded her apartment on Christmas Eve. They were simple stories, mundane, but they painted colors Daniel hadn't seen in months. She never asked about his accident, never asked about Vanessa, never even mentioned the word blind. It was like she had accepted all of him the moment she walked through the door. On Friday, she did something no one had dared to do in months. She wheeled him out onto the back patio. "This is kidnapping," he said flatly. "This is vitamin D," she replied. "Now, stop scowling. The sun's out. That alone is a miracle in this city." He didn't respond, but he let her park the wheelchair by the garden. "There's a hummingbird feeder just a few feet away," she said, "and your roses are still trying to bloom. Not bad for February." "My roses?" "Yeah," she said, amused. "You've got a garden out here, didn't you know?" "I stopped seeing it a long time ago," he said quietly. She didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she described it. "There's one bush that's trying really hard. The petals are red, no, more like crimson, deep and velvety, the kind you'd see in an old painting. And there's this one, hummingbird, tiny thing, emerald green like it was dipped in glitter. Keeps coming back every morning at 8:13. It's like clockwork." He closed his eyes behind the sunglasses he didn't need but wore anyway. Something in his chest cracked open, just a little. "You talk like I can still see," he said. She didn't miss a beat. "Maybe I'm hoping you'll start to." That night, for the first time since the accident, Daniel asked Margaret how long Emily was staying. "She's on a contract for now," his mother replied. "No reason." The next day, when Emily arrived, she was singing. "Now you're just showing off," he said from the chair. She grinned. "What can I say? I'm in a good mood." "Why, I won $20 on a scratch ticket and got upgraded to almond milk for free. I'm practically royalty." Daniel chuckled. It felt foreign in his throat, like a sound he hadn't made in years. Maybe he hadn't. Later that afternoon, he heard a loud crash from the living room. "What the hell was that?" Emily swore under her breath. "Sorry, I tripped on the rug and broke one of your weird modern vases." "Ugly thing anyway," he said. "I always hated it. Then I did you a favor." He laughed, a real one this time, and she joined in, the sound of it bubbling through the house like champagne. In the following days, he found himself listening for her footsteps. He pretended not to care, but he noticed when she was late. He found excuses to ask her things. He started eating the bread. He didn't say thank you, not exactly. But one morning, he asked if she liked jazz. "Depends," she said. "Are we talking elevator jazz or Coltrane?" "I have a record player," he said. "It still works." They sat in the living room that afternoon, listening to a scratchy vinyl play in a sentimental mood. Emily didn't talk. She just sat there, close enough that he could smell her shampoo. Lavender and rosemary. The song ended, and neither of them moved. The next day, she didn't come. Daniel waited. The hours crawled by. The silence felt heavier than before, thicker. He told himself he didn't care, but he kept checking the time. At 6:14 p.m., the door opened. "Sorry," she called out. "Bus broke down, then it started raining, and some guy tried to sell me a ferret at the station. It's been a day." Daniel exhaled. "You want soup or tea?" she asked. "Tea." She paused. "Did you just ask for something?" "Don't get used to it." Emmeline just smiled. He couldn't see it, but he felt it anyway. The days began to blur together. But for the first time in months, Daniel found himself noticing the rhythm of them. Not just the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall or the sound of the rain against the windows, but something deeper, a hum of life returning, subtly and almost unwillingly. It began with small things. How he started waking up a few minutes earlier than usual. How he listened for the sound of Emily's keys clinking as she came through the door, and how, without fully realizing it, he had stopped keeping count of the days since Vanessa had left. Emily had a habit of narrating her actions when she cleaned or moved around, not for his benefit necessarily, but as if it helped her stay connected to the space. "Okay, Mr. Vacuum, don't fail me today," she'd say, followed by the hum of the machine and the occasional thud when it bumped into furniture. "That wasn't me. That was the ghost of bad design choices," she'd add, almost like she was talking to herself, but always just loud enough for him to hear, and he did. He listened more than he admitted. One Tuesday morning, she arrived carrying something that smelled suspiciously like cinnamon rolls. "You brought sugar bombs again," he said from the couch, not bothering to hide the amusement in his voice. "I call it therapy and icing, thank you very much. And technically, they're apple cinnamon rolls, so there's fruit. It's healthy." Daniel didn't answer, but the grin on his face said everything. Emily placed the container on the table and started unpacking things. "So, guess what? I bought a radio from a thrift store down the block. Vintage, works like a charm. It's got this big, ugly dial you'll love." "I don't love ugly things," he said. "You hired me," she shot back without missing a beat. That made him laugh. Actually laugh. And she paused for a second, clearly savoring the sound. She plugged in the radio and turned the dial slowly. A burst of static filled the room before settling into a smooth jazz station. The notes of a tenor saxophone curled through the air like smoke. Daniel tilted his head toward the sound. "Not bad. Only the best for you, sir," she said with a playful bow he couldn't see but somehow sensed. Later that day, while she swept the hallway, she started telling a story about her brother trying to impress a girl when they were kids. He rode his bike with no hands while juggling oranges, crashed straight into a fence, needed 5 stitches. Daniel chuckled. "And the girl?" She laughed so hard she gave him her juice box. First and last time he ever dated a gymnast. It was stories like that, silly, innocent, vivid, that somehow made Daniel feel like the world wasn't entirely out of reach. He couldn't see the sunshine on the floorboards, but he could hear it in her voice. He could smell it in the apple cinnamon rolls. He could feel it in the way his shoulders didn't hunch so tightly anymore. One afternoon, while she was watering the indoor plants near the window, Daniel heard a crash. "What was that?" he called out. Emily groaned. "I knocked over the ficus. Again. You should really fire me." "I've considered it," he said, "but no one else brings baked goods." He imagined her rolling her eyes. That same day, something shifted. Emily suggested they take a walk outside, just a short one. Daniel resisted, of course. "I'm blind, remember?" he said flatly. "Yup, and I have 2 good legs and the stubbornness of a mule. Come on, it's not a hike, it's just your backyard." He didn't want to admit it, but part of him missed the garden, missed the warmth of sunlight on his face, the scent of freshly mown grass, the buzz of bees weaving around lavender blooms. He hadn't been out there since before the crash, since before his world turned to ink. "I don't know," he mumbled. "5 minutes," she offered. "If you hate it, I'll carry you back inside and never mention it again." "Like hell you could carry me." "You have no idea how much adrenaline baked goods give me," she replied, her voice grinning. Reluctantly, he agreed. It was awkward at first. Emily guided him slowly down the steps, one hand on his arm, the other on his back. He walked cautiously, every step measured, unsure of where the ground ended and uncertainty began. But then the breeze hit him, soft, crisp, and tinged with the scent of jasmine. "There's a bench just ahead," Emily said. "Beneath the elm tree. Your mom said it was your favorite." He sat. Slowly, carefully. "I used to drink my coffee here," he murmured. Watched the sun come up over the sound. Emily sat beside him, close but not too close. "Well, today there's a squirrel losing his mind over a pine cone, and your roses are blooming like they think it's May." He smirked. "That's a weird way to describe it. I'm a weird kind of person." They sat in silence for a while. The breeze lifted her hair, and she closed her eyes, letting the moment settle. Daniel didn't speak, but he didn't retreat either. Something about the fresh air, the subtle rustle of leaves, and her quiet presence beside him started peeling away at the layers of concrete he'd built around himself. "You describe things like you're painting them," he said eventually. "Like, I'm supposed to see it all through your eyes." "You kind of are," she replied. "I figure if I keep doing it long enough, maybe one day you will." Daniel turned his face toward her. He couldn't see her expression, but he could hear the hope in her voice. It scared him a little. That night, after she left, he found himself walking slowly through the house, alone, just feeling it out. The walls, the furniture, the familiar creaks in the floorboards. Everything felt different. Not better, just less suffocating. The next morning, Emily came in humming again. "Morning, Daniel. Want to sit outside again?" "Sure," he said, surprising both of them. Outside, she described the clouds. "They're those big fluffy ones, like whipped cream, like the sky's having dessert." He grinned. "You really like food metaphors." "Only because they work. Clouds, whipped cream, heartbreak. Same texture." "Is heartbreak supposed to taste sweet?" "No, but it always comes when you're not expecting it, just like dessert." Daniel tilted his head back. "You've been heartbroken?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah, more than once. But every time, I figured out how to stand back up, even if it took longer than I liked." He nodded slowly. "You're good at that." "What?" "Standing back up." Emily didn't answer. But the smile she gave him was almost audible. The rest of the week, Daniel asked for the garden walk every afternoon. He wouldn't admit it outright, but Emily knew. Knew he needed it. knew he needed her. One day, she brought out an old chessboard. The pieces had textures carved into them. Circles for pawns, triangles for knights, stars for queens. She placed his hand on the board. "I found this online. It's for the visually impaired. Want to play?" "I haven't played in years," he said. "Perfect. I'll definitely win." They played for an hour. He won, barely. "Beginner's luck," she said, pouting. "I'm not a beginner. You haven't played in years, remember? Muscle memory." "Fine, but next time I'm bringing snacks. Chess deserves popcorn." He smiled as he reset the pieces. "You make everything seem lighter." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Maybe that's what you've been missing." Daniel didn't reply. He didn't need to. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about whipped cream clouds, textured chess pieces, and the sound of her humming. He remembered the way she described sunlight, the way her voice danced around even when her words were serious, and he realized something terrifying. He was starting to feel again. Not just exist, not just breathe, but feel. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Hayes didn't feel like dying. The suggestion came so softly, Daniel almost didn't catch it. They were sitting in the garden one warm afternoon in late spring, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and cut grass. Emily was recounting a story about her uncle's failed attempt at a backyard bee farm. Something about hives collapsing, honey fermenting, and a very angry neighbor with a peanut allergy. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got a whole catalog of disaster relatives, don't you?" "We're cursed in the most entertaining ways," she said, leaning back on the bench. "Though I guess it's kept life interesting." He smiled, the kind that now came easier, though always tinged with hesitation. His sightless gaze lifted toward the sky, and for a long moment they both said nothing. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It breathed. Then Emily said it. "I read about this surgeon," she started, her voice slow, testing the waters. "In Zurich, Switzerland. He specializes in corneal transplant procedures. Experimental, but successful in some cases." Daniel's body stiffened just slightly. She noticed. She always noticed. "I'm not saying it'll work," she added quickly, "but it might. I just thought." "No," he said, cutting her off without anger, just finality. "No." Emily looked down at her hands, clasped in her lap. She didn't push. She never did. But she also didn't let go of things easily. "Okay," she said simply. But the idea had already been spoken, and now it lingered in the air like the buzz of bees her uncle never managed to keep. That night, Daniel barely slept. He didn't want to think about surgery, about hope, about the possibility of seeing again. Because what if he couldn't? What if he tried and failed? What if he hoped and it all shattered? It was safer in the dark. The next morning, Emily didn't bring it up. She made oatmeal, which he claimed to hate, but ate anyway. They played another round of textured chess. She cheated once, he caught her, of course, and she laughed so hard she choked on her tea. That evening, Margaret came into his study, her tone more serious than usual. "Emily told me about the doctor," she said, arms folded, her eyes narrowing in that way only mothers could manage. Daniel sighed. "Mom, she's not trying to fix you," Margaret said. "She's trying to give you a choice." He didn't answer. "She cares about you, Daniel," she added, softer now. "You might not see it, Yet, but I do. 5. I don't want to hope for something that might never happen, he muttered. Then don't hope, she replied. Just try. He stayed quiet, her words sinking into him like rain into dry earth. Days passed. Emily never mentioned Zurich again, but Daniel could feel it. Like a shadow under her voice, every time she described a cloud, a color, a blooming flower. She was still painting the world for him, but now he realized she was also daring him to look again. It was a Thursday when he finally spoke. "Tell me more about the surgeon," he said, somewhere between a command and a confession. Emily froze mid-step in the hallway. When she turned to face him, her smile was quiet, but it reached all the way to her voice. "He's done over 40 procedures," she said. "Success rates not guaranteed, but if it works, you could regain partial vision, maybe more." He nodded slowly. "Book it." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Tests, paperwork, consultations over encrypted calls. Daniel hated every second of it. Doctors speaking slowly to him like he was fragile. Technicians touching his face with latex-covered fingers. The waiting, the noise. But through it all, Emily stayed by his side, reading him the forms, calming him down when he almost bailed, whispering jokes when the nurses weren't looking. They flew out in mid-May. Zurich was colder than expected, clean, quiet. The hospital overlooked Lake Zurich, and even though Daniel couldn't see the view, Emily described it with reverence. "It's like the lake was painted by someone in love," she said one morning. "Sounds nauseating," he muttered. "You'd love it," she said. The surgery date was set. Daniel spent the night before lying awake in a sterile hospital bed, his thoughts a tornado. What if he woke up and everything was still dark? What if the first thing he saw was disappointment in Emily's eyes? He almost pulled out of it. But then Emily came in, wearing her usual scarf and holding a cup of terrible hospital coffee. "You're scared," she said gently. He didn't deny it. "So am I," she added, "but I'd rather be scared with you than brave by myself." He reached for her hand. Her fingers were cold but steady. "Stay," he said. "Oh, wait." The morning of the surgery, Margaret joined them at the hospital, her composure cracking only once when she kissed his forehead and whispered something he couldn't quite catch. They wheeled him into the operating room. The lights above him were mere ghosts through his damaged eyes. A heartbeat monitor beeped steadily as the world blurred into anesthesia. Hours passed. When Daniel woke, everything was wrapped in bandages. His eyes, his head, even his thoughts. The doctor spoke in a calm voice, explaining what they'd done, what they'd found, what they hoped. But Daniel didn't hear most of it. He was listening for one thing. Emily. She appeared beside his bed just after the doctor left. He couldn't see her, not yet, but he knew it was her. Her scent, her voice, her presence. Undeniable. "Hey," she said, and his heart steadied. "How long?" he asked. 2 days, she said. Then the bandages come off. The next 48 hours felt like an eternity. Every minute stretched and curled into a knot in his stomach. Emily never left the room. Margaret took turns sleeping in the chair by the window. Nurses came and went, murmuring reassurances Daniel didn't believe. Then, finally, the day came. He sat upright in the bed, heart pounding like he was facing a firing squad. The surgeon stood at his side, a nurse on the other. Emily and Margaret sat a few feet away, holding their breath. The doctor began unwrapping the gauze, slowly, methodically. "Open your eyes," he said. Daniel hesitated. Then, with a tremble in his hands, he obeyed. At first, there was only light. Blinding, overwhelming light that pierced through the darkness like a scream. He shut his eyes again instinctively, heart racing. "Easy," the doctor said. "That's good. That's a good sign." He tried again. Shapes formed. Blurs. Shadows. And then clarity. A face. Soft brown curls. Eyes wide with tears. A mouth quivering with a smile. "Emily, can you see me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniel blinked, tears slipping from his eyes without permission. "You're more beautiful than I imagined," he whispered. She let out a laugh that cracked into a sob and covered her mouth with both hands. Margaret cried quietly beside her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Daniel reached out blindly, then corrected himself, looking down at his hands with wonder. He reached out, for real this time, and took Emily's hand. She gripped his fingers like a lifeline. In the days that followed, he adjusted to the strangeness of seeing again. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps, flashes, times when the world felt too bright or too fast. But it was his. And with every new image, every rediscovered texture and color, there was Emily, helping him navigate this new old world with a steadiness that never faltered. One morning, as they walked together through a park near the hospital, Daniel stopped. The lake shimmered in the distance. The sky was painted in strokes of gold and lavender. Birds dipped into the water like brushstrokes come to life. "Is it everything I said it was?" Emily asked. He looked at her. Really looked. "It's better," he said, "because you're in it." She blushed and, for once, had nothing clever to say. They returned to Seattle 2 weeks later, but nothing felt the same. Daniel saw everything with new eyes, literally and figuratively. The mansion wasn't a tomb anymore. The halls echoed not with silence, but with life, with laughter, with color. And everywhere he turned, there was Emily, the woman who had painted his world when it was dark, and now stood beside him as he began to paint it himself. The plane touched down in Seattle under a heavy gray sky, but to Daniel, it was the most beautiful sky he'd ever seen. Through the window he watched as raindrops slid in slow trails down the glass, the city skyline rising like a familiar memory he hadn't dared to believe he'd ever see again. As they taxied to the gate, Emily rested her head lightly against his shoulder. She'd fallen asleep halfway through the flight, her hand still wrapped in his. Her breathing was steady, calm, and the weight of her against him was a comfort more powerful than words. He didn't wake her until the wheels stopped moving. "Hey," he whispered, brushing her cheek. "We're home." She stirred, blinked, and smiled. "Did you just call it home?" He smiled back. "I guess I did." Back at the mansion, everything was exactly where it had been left. The tall arch ceilings, the immaculate marble floors, the elegant, cold furnishings. All of it was the same. And yet, it felt different. Because now he could see it. Now, when Emily opened the curtains in the morning, he didn't just hear the rustle. He watched light pour into the room like gold spilling across hardwood floors. Now, when she laughed at one of her own jokes, he could see the way her eyes crinkled, and how she bit her lip when trying not to smile too wide. It was overwhelming, the sheer intimacy of vision. The small things most people took for granted hit him like emotional earthquakes. Steam curling from a cup of tea. A bird hopping across the patio. the messy bun Emily wore on cleaning days. The world was vivid and noisy and alive, and he loved it. But with clarity came confusion. Not everything was as simple as joy. One morning, maybe 2 weeks after returning, Daniel sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee and watching Emily dance around to a song playing on the old radio. She was barefoot, wearing a loose gray sweater and jeans with a tear at the knee, a wooden spoon in one hand, and pancake batter on her cheek. She was radiant. And he realized, truly realized, just how far he'd fallen for her. That terrified him. She caught him watching and wiggled her eyebrows. "What?" she teased. "Never seen moves like these before?" He laughed. "You're gonna break your ankle." "Nah, I've got dancer's bones." "Is that a real thing?" "Nope. But if I say it with confidence, you'll believe me." That was Emily, completely unpredictable, beautifully sincere, and utterly disarming. Later that afternoon, as he sat on the back patio, reading, yes, actually reading, he heard the gate buzz at the front of the property. Margaret was inside napping, and Emily was in the garden. "Yeah, I'll get it," she called. Daniel returned to his book. A few minutes passed. Then, silence. Then, the door creaked open, and a voice that should have stayed buried in memory floated into the hallway. "Daniel?" He froze. The voice was hesitant, almost broken, but still unmistakable. "Vanessa." He turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing. The air in the room seemed to thin. She stepped into view, standing just past the foyer, clutching a worn leather suitcase. Her once perfectly styled blonde hair was damp with rain, her makeup smeared, her eyes wide with something that looked like guilt or desperation. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice cracking. Daniel stood up, his pulse pounding. Emily appeared behind her, arms crossed, face unreadable. Vanessa glanced between them. I was stupid, Daniel. I made the worst mistake of my life. And now, I don't have anything. No money, no place to stay. The guy I left with, he dumped me. Said I was too much baggage. Daniel didn't respond, not right away. His jaw clenched, and his eyes locked onto hers. Eyes that could see now, really see. "I was blind," he said, voice low. "And you left me." Her face crumpled. "I was scared. You were different, broken. And now that I'm not, you want to come back?" he asked. "I'm not asking for everything," she whispered. "Just somewhere to stay. Please." Emily stepped aside, leaving the decision to him. Daniel nodded stiffly. "You can stay the night, but that's it." Vanessa swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you." That evening, the house was too quiet. Emily kept to herself, retreating to the guest room she now used when she stayed overnight. Daniel sat in the living room, staring at the fireplace, his thoughts a mess of anger, confusion, and old wounds reopening like fresh cuts. Later, he knocked on Emily's door. She opened it, eyes tired, expression guarded. "I'm sorry," he said. "You don't have to apologize," she replied. "It's not my place." He shook his head. "That's the thing. It is." She looked at him for a long time, then stepped aside and let him in. They sat on the edge of the bed, shoulder to shoulder. "I don't feel anything for her," Daniel said quietly. "Just betrayal, and maybe a little pity." Emily nodded. But it still hurts. He looked down at his hands. Yeah, it does. You don't have to rush, she said, to feel something or not feel something. I don't want to be where I'm not needed. He turned to her then, really looked at her. You are the reason I even tried. You are the reason I can see again. You're not just needed, Emily. You're everything. She blinked, startled. Then she smiled, small and sad. You're not ready to say that yet. Daniel started to protest, but she shook her head. It's okay. I'm not going anywhere. Just figure out what you really want. The next morning, Vanessa was gone, left a note and nothing more. No goodbye, no thank you. Daniel wasn't surprised. Later that day, as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, Daniel found Emily in the garden, hands deep in the soil, as she replanted tulips. Can I help? He asked. She looked up, shielding her eyes. You sure? You'll get dirt on those fancy shoes. He kicked them off. Then, I'll go barefoot. They worked in silence for a few minutes before Daniel said, I was wrong last night. And she didn't look up. About what? I am ready to say it. I just didn't know how. Now she turned to him, curiosity softening her features. I love you, he said, steady and certain. I've been falling for you since you brought me banana bread and told me your washing machine flooded on Christmas. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. Not yet. And I'm scared, he added. But not of loving you. Just of not being enough. Emily reached across the flower bed, smearing dirt across his hand as she took it. You're more than enough, and I love you too. For the first time in years, Daniel felt light. Not because the past was gone, he knew it never truly left, but because the future finally felt like something he wanted to walk into. Together, hand in hand, they finished planting the tulips. The sun warmed their skin, and somewhere above them, a hummingbird darted through the air, wings buzzing like applause. Daniel looked up at the sky and smiled. The world was no longer just visible. It was alive. It started with a letter. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table one evening, sipping a glass of wine and watching Emily fold laundry on the couch. Her hair was damp from the shower, her sweatshirt was 3 sizes too big, and her laugh kept slipping out in bursts as she watched a cooking show where the contestants were trying to make gourmet meals with vending machine snacks. Everything about the moment felt perfect in its simplicity. Until Margaret entered the room, envelope in hand, her face tight. This came for you, she said. Daniel took the envelope, flipping it over. The return address was from a law firm. From who? Emily asked, sitting upright. He opened it and read in silence. Then, with a breath that rattled like old shutters, he said, Vanessa. Emily froze. What does she want now? Daniel stared at the paper, anger flickering in his newly healed eyes. She's suing me. What? Margaret barked. Emily stood and walked over. For what? She claims we were never formally divorced, that she still has a legal right to half of my assets. Margaret let out a curse Daniel had never heard from her mouth before. I had the papers drawn up, Daniel muttered. She left. She signed them, I remember. Emily reached for his hand. You never filed them, did you? Daniel blinked. What? The papers, she said gently. You never took them to the court. You were still in shock, still grieving. I remember the drawer you stuffed them in. I asked you once, and you said you couldn't deal with it then. His heart sank. Margaret's voice was sharp. She's trying to take advantage of your kindness, of your pain." Daniel said nothing for a long time. His mind reeled back to those early days, when he couldn't even find his toothbrush without help, when the thought of courtrooms and lawyers felt as foreign as the stars. Emily squeezed his fingers. "We'll fight it." The days that followed were a blur of meetings with attorneys, digging through old paperwork, and trying to piece together a legal timeline that had become a blur in the wake of his accident. His lawyer, a sharp but compassionate woman named Angela Cruz, assured him they had a solid case. There were witnesses, messages, receipts, proof that Vanessa had abandoned the marriage and never returned. "She has no claim," Angela said firmly, "but it will be ugly." It was. Even before the court date, Vanessa's lawyers began sending requests, probing into Daniel's finances, painting a picture of a man who had left his wife during a vulnerable period, twisting the truth into something unrecognizable. Emily tried to keep things light at home. She made chocolate chip pancakes for dinner one night, tried to teach Daniel how to knead bread dough, convinced Margaret to play board games with them. But the tension simmered beneath it all. One evening, Daniel sat on the patio staring out into the dark. Emily found him there, silent and stiff. "She's going to drag everything out," he said. "Every mistake I ever made, every moment of weakness." Emily sat beside him. "And you'll face it. Because you're not that man anymore. What if the court thinks I was? What if they believe her? They won't, but even if they do, then we start again, from scratch if we have to." Daniel turned toward her. "Why are you still here?" She blinked. "What? You didn't sign up for this. You didn't sign up for lawsuits and ex-wives and me breaking down every other day." "No," she said quietly. "I signed up for you." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I'm terrified of losing everything again." "You won't lose me," she replied. And that, for the moment, was enough. The trial date arrived with a gray, drizzling sky and a knot in Daniel's stomach the size of a bowling ball. The courtroom was smaller than he expected, colder, and far too quiet. Vanessa sat at the opposing table, her hair pulled back tightly, her expression polished, but her eyes flickering with unease. Daniel hadn't seen her since she walked out the door, and the sight of her now stirred something in him. Something like grief, but old and hollow. Angela stood to present their case. She was calm, factual, and relentless. She walked the judge through the timeline, showed the messages Vanessa had sent to her lover, messages Daniel had forgotten he'd saved. She called Margaret to testify, then Emily. Emily sat on the witness stand, hands clasped in her lap. Her voice didn't shake. "I was hired to care for Daniel after his accident," she said. "He was grieving, not just the loss of his sight, but of a marriage that had already ended." Vanessa's attorney tried to poke holes in her testimony, implying she had influenced Daniel, that perhaps she had motives of her own. Emily smiled sweetly and said, "The only motive I ever had was to make sure he wanted to live again." Daniel felt something twist in his chest. When it was his turn to speak, he stood slowly and walked to the front of the courtroom. His voice was steady, but every word felt like it cost him a piece of his soul. "She left me when I was at my lowest," he said. "And I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it's true. She made a choice, and I survived it. I rebuilt my life. I didn't ask her for anything, but now she wants to take the one thing I finally have again: peace." The judge listened without expression. Vanessa looked away. When the verdict came hours later, it was swift and merciful. The court ruled in Daniel's favor. The previous documentation was deemed sufficient. The court declared the marriage effectively over years ago. Vanessa had no legal claim to any of Daniel's assets. When he walked out of the courthouse, Emily was waiting on the steps, arms open. He went straight into them. "You did it," she whispered. "We did," he said. Back at home, Margaret threw a small celebration. She poured orange juice into wine glasses and made toast with fancy jam. "To freedom," she said, raising her glass. Emily laughed. "To jam." "To family," Daniel said, looking at both of them. "Chosen. Or otherwise." That night, long after Margaret had gone to bed and the dishes were cleared, Daniel and Emily sat on the floor of the living room, backs against the couch, staring at the fire. "I feel like I can breathe again," he said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Good. Now maybe you'll stop stress-eating all the leftover lasagna. I thought you made that for me." "I did, but not all 5 containers." He chuckled, then turned to her. "Emily? I love you." She smiled. "You already said that." "I know," he said, "but I want to keep saying it. I want to keep choosing you." She turned, cupped his face, and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss born of adrenaline or relief. It was soft, certain, and slow. A kiss that spoke of promises not yet made, but already understood. The fire crackled beside them, the rain tapping gently at the windows. Daniel had seen a lot in his life. Success, failure, darkness, and light. But nothing had ever looked quite as beautiful as the way Emily looked at him in that moment. Like he was home. And for the first time, he truly believed it. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft amber glow across the kitchen walls, when Daniel stepped inside barefoot, holding something behind his back. Emily was already there, humming quietly as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. Her hair was still damp from the shower, and she wore one of his oversized flannel shirts, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. A sight that made Daniel pause for a second just to take it in. "Good morning," he said, stepping toward her. "Good morning," she replied, smiling over her shoulder. "You're up early. I thought you'd sleep in after the week we've had." He moved to the kitchen island and placed a small box wrapped in brown paper in front of her. "I couldn't sleep. Thought I'd work on a surprise." Emily looked at the package, then back at him, her brows raised. "What's this?" "Open it." She peeled back the paper gently, revealing a worn navy mull notebook with the words "Emily's Hearth" written in his handwriting across the front. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were page after page of rough business plans, sketches of booth layouts, sample menus written in pencil, and even names of potential suppliers. She looked up, eyes wide. "Daniel!" "I know you said it was just a dream," he said, his voice soft. "But dreams don't have to stay that way. I did some research. There's a small space on Pine Street, near that flower shop you like. Sunny in the mornings, low rent. I thought we could turn it into your bakery. Together." Emily stared at him, speechless. "I'll take care of the paperwork and finances," he added. "You just bring the magic." Her throat tightened. "You remembered? Every time you talked about it, your voice changed. Like you were already there, serving cookies and singing to the radio while covered in flour." She closed the notebook gently and came around the island to hug him. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack." She laughed through her tears and kissed him. "Then I guess we're opening a bakery." The days that followed were a whirlwind of energy, laughter, and mess. So many messes. They visited the space together, and while it was little more than a dusty storefront with cracked tiles and a flickering ceiling fan, Emily walked through it like it was a palace. She pointed out where the oven would go, where she'd put a small counter for tea, and where she'd hang photos of her parents and the first dollar they'd earn. Daniel watched her in awe. Margaret got involved too, naturally. She came armed with a notebook, a tape measure, and fierce opinions about where the cash register should go. If you want return customers, your cookie display needs to be right by the door, she said, tapping the spot with her cane. Noted, Emily grinned. Chief Consultant Margaret Hayes, in charge of cookie traffic. They spent long nights painting the walls, soft cream with blush undertones, and sanding down wooden shelves. Daniel handled the permits and legal logistics, navigating city bureaucracy with the same quiet intensity he used to build his tech empire. But this time, he wasn't building for profit. He was building for love. Emily tested recipes like a mad scientist, and Daniel was her forever test subject. "You're going to make me diabetic," he said one night, licking frosting off his finger. "You love it?" she teased. "I do, but my pancreas hates you." They laughed until their sides ached. Even the kitchen disasters became memories worth treasuring, like the time she dropped an entire tray of mini tarts on the floor, stared at the mess, then shrugged and said, "Well, the floor needed a snack." They decided to call the shop Emily's Hearth, just like the notebook. It felt personal, warm. On the day before their grand opening, Daniel surprised her again. They were sitting in the empty shop, surrounded by the scent of fresh paint and cinnamon, when he handed her a second box. Inside was a new apron, printed with tiny roses and her name embroidered in looping script. She laughed. "It's beautiful. There's more." Beneath the apron was a small plaque. Emily's Hearth, founded with love. Emily's breath caught. "Daniel, it's yours," he said. "All of it." The next morning, they opened the doors. The neighborhood turned out in full force. Friends, curious locals, even the florist next door popped in carrying a bouquet of daisies for good luck. Kids pressed their faces to the glass, staring wide-eyed at the cakes and cookies. Emily, flushed and beaming, moved behind the counter like she'd been doing it her whole life. Daniel worked the register, fumbling with change, but winning everyone over with his smile. Margaret stood by the front door, handing out samples like a proud general overseeing a battlefield of pastries. "You better enjoy this," she said to one customer. "That's my daughter-in-law, and she's going to be famous." Daniel turned red. Emily just winked. By noon they had sold out of muffins and nearly ran out of coffee. A little boy with chocolate smeared across his chin tugged on Emily's apron and said, "This is the best cookie I've ever had." She almost cried. After the last customer left, they locked the door and collapsed onto the floor behind the counter, laughing, covered in flour, and happier than they'd ever been. "We did it," Emily whispered. "No," Daniel corrected, brushing a smudge of powdered sugar from her nose. "You did it." She looked around at the shop, the soft lights, the fading smell of cinnamon and butter. "You know," she said, "my dad used to say that happiness is a warm kitchen and someone to share it with." Daniel smiled. "Then I hope this place never cools down." They spent the evening cleaning and dancing barefoot on the bakery floor to old songs from the radio, and for a while, it felt like nothing could touch them. But joy, as they had both learned, often travels beside sorrow. 3 days later, Emily received a call from home. Her mother's voice was tight, Her father had collapsed. Heart complications. It didn't look good. Emily packed a bag within the hour, hands trembling as she tried to zip it shut. Daniel came into the bedroom just as she wiped a tear from her cheek. "You're not going alone," he said, taking her bag. "We'll go together." The drive to her hometown was quiet, the mood heavy, the sky overcast. Emily stared out the window most of the way, clutching Daniel's hand when the silence grew too loud. When they arrived, her mother met them at the door of a small, worn house surrounded by sunflowers. Her eyes were swollen. Her hug said everything. Emily's father was resting in bed, pale but awake. He smiled when she entered, his eyes crinkling with pride despite the oxygen tube in his nose. "My girl," he rasped, voice thin. "You made it." Emily sat beside him and held his hand. "Of course I did." Daniel stood quietly in the corner until the older man beckoned him over. "So, you're the one she talks about," he said. "I hope so," Daniel replied. "Take care of her," he whispered. "She's got fire in her, makes her strong. But sometimes it burns too much inside." Daniel nodded, eyes wet. "I will. Always." The next morning, Emily's father passed away. It happened gently, in his sleep, while Emily dozed beside him with her hand still wrapped in his. When she woke, the silence was too quiet. She didn't cry right away. She just sat there, numb, until Daniel knelt in front of her and pulled her into his arms. "I'm right here," he whispered. "I've got you." She broke then, weeping against his chest, her grief deep and aching, and Daniel held her through it all, letting her fall apart so he could help her put the pieces back together. They stayed a few days for the funeral. Daniel cooked when Emily's mother couldn't. He made terrible coffee and burned toast, but he kept doing it anyway. He chased the neighbor's dog when it got into the trash and got locked in the garage with a raccoon once, which made Emily laugh for the first time since the hospital. "I'm keeping you," she told him through tears of laughter. "Please do," he replied. When they returned to Seattle, the bakery had been left untouched, but it felt different now, quieter, a little heavier. Still, Emily stepped back into it with purpose, because now it wasn't just her dream. It was a promise to her father, to herself, to the life she and Daniel were building, brick by brick, loaf by loaf, together. The soft scent of coffee and vanilla filled the kitchen as Emily hummed to herself, tying the strings of her apron with practiced ease. Sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the mansion, catching specks of flour floating in the air. It had been 2 weeks since they returned from her hometown, 2 weeks since she said goodbye to her father, the strongest man she'd ever known. Grief still sat behind her eyes, but there was something else now, something stronger. Resolve. Daniel entered the kitchen holding a newspaper and 2 mugs of coffee. He handed her one, kissing the top of her head, before sliding onto the stool at the island. "You're up early," she said. "I like watching you in the mornings," he said. "You move like a storm with a schedule." She rolled her eyes, but smiled. A bakery doesn't run on its own. Emily's hearth had become more than just a bakery. It was a sanctuary, a place where neighbors met over hot cocoa, children pressed their noses to the display glass, and tourists left with crumbs on their shirts and joy in their hearts. But for Emily and Daniel, it was more than even that. It was theirs. Built with scraped walls and scraped knees, laughter, exhaustion, love, and faith. The business was thriving. The shop was expanding its menu, and Margaret, now unofficially dubbed the scone supervisor, had taken it upon herself to become the voice of their social media account, which was unintentionally hilarious. Emily, Margaret had once typed into the caption box, not realizing it wasn't a search bar. Post this. Today's cinnamon rolls are fluffier than Daniel's ego. Sales doubled that day. But something had been brewing in Daniel's mind ever since the trip, a thought he couldn't quite shake. It came back to him again that evening as they lay curled together on the couch. The fireplace crackled nearby, and Emily was reading aloud from a book they both loved, one of those novels that never got old, no matter how many times you revisited its pages. "I've been thinking," Daniel said when she paused for a sip of tea. "That's dangerous," she teased. "I'm serious." He turned slightly to look at her. "About us. About the future." She set the book down. "What kind of future?" "The kind where we don't keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. The kind where we just live, fully, together, as a family." Her expression softened. "You mean, I want to marry you, Emily. No big speech this time. No perfect timing or grand gestures, just this. I love you, and I don't want to wait anymore." Her eyes filled with tears. "Daniel?" He took her hands in his. "I know we've already been through so much, and I know your heart's still healing. But I also know I've never been more certain of anything in my life." She smiled through her tears, laughing a little as she wiped them away. "Yes. Of course, yes." They decided to keep the wedding small, just close friends, neighbors, and a few family members. Margaret insisted on having it in the garden of the mansion. "The one good thing about all this square footage is we don't have to pay for a venue," she declared. Emily designed her own bouquet using sunflowers and daisies, the same flowers that had grown outside her childhood home. Daniel wore a simple gray suit and couldn't stop fidgeting with the boutonniere Emily had pinned on him. The ceremony was simple, honest, and beautiful. Emily walked down the aisle barefoot, her dress flowing behind her like a whisper. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off her. The world went quiet the moment she reached him, like everything else faded into soft colors and distant echoes. Their vows were short, heartfelt, and full of quiet jokes only the two of them understood. "I promise to always be your taste tester," Daniel said, voice thick with emotion, "even when you know that chocolate cake was a disaster." Emily grinned. "And I promise to remind you that your perfect scrambled eggs are always a little rubbery, but I'll eat them anyway, because you made them for me." The guests laughed and cried in equal measure. Margaret sobbed openly and offered everyone handkerchiefs she'd embroidered herself. When the sun began to set, casting golden light across the garden, they shared their first dance on the lawn. It wasn't choreographed, it wasn't graceful, but it was real. Daniel stepped on Emily's toes twice. She kissed his nose and said, "Good thing you're cute." The evening ended with fireworks Daniel had arranged as a surprise. As the sky lit up in streaks of red and silver, Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. "I never imagined this," she whispered. "I did," he said, "from the moment you brought banana bread into my life." The weeks after the wedding were filled with a new rhythm. They settled into married life like two puzzle pieces, finally finding their place. Emily's hearth continued to grow, and the small community around them seemed to grow with it. Children left crayon drawings for Emily on the counter. Elderly couples came in every Friday for the same lemon tart and peppermint tea. Daniel built a small office in the back of the shop where he handled logistics, supplier orders, and spreadsheets. He claimed he hated it, but Emily always caught him humming while he worked. Then, one bright Saturday morning, as they sat outside on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky, Emily placed a small envelope on Daniel's lap. He looked at her, then at the envelope. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a photograph, black and white, blurry. He blinked. "Is that?" She nodded. 8 weeks. He stared at the ultrasound picture, his hands trembling. Yes." A tear slid down his cheek before he even knew it was coming. He looked up at her, heart pounding, voice soft. "You're going to be a mom. And you're going to be a dad." They held each other for a long time, laughing and crying all at once. Margaret found them on the porch a half-hour later and screamed loud enough to startle the mailman. "This baby is going to eat more sugar than any child in America," she declared. "I'm knitting bibs tonight." The months that followed were filled with more chaos and beauty than either of them had expected. Morning sickness, baby name debates, nursery painting disasters, and moments so tender they barely needed words. Daniel read every book he could find on parenting. Emily found him asleep one night with a book called How to Swaddle Like a Pro, open on his chest. "You're going to be incredible," she whispered, tucking a blanket around him. They welcomed their baby girl on a rainy Tuesday in early spring. She arrived screaming, healthy and already gripping Daniel's pinky like she'd known him her whole life. They named her Grace, because that's what she was. A miracle. A gift neither of them had expected but had somehow always been hoping for. Emily's hearth added a new menu item that week, Grace's sugar cookies. Soft, sweet, and warm, just like her. The shop became a second home to Grace. She spent her mornings tucked into a bassinet in the back room, afternoons in Emily's arms, and evenings falling asleep to the hum of the coffee machine and the murmur of satisfied customers. Daniel often stood behind the counter, holding Grace against his chest, watching Emily laugh with regulars or decorate cakes with Margaret. One day, as the sun poured through the windows and the smell of cinnamon filled the air, Daniel whispered into his daughter's ear, "You're going to hear this story one day, Gracie, about how I lost everything, my sight, my hope, my way. But then your mom walked into my life with banana bread and sunshine and showed me the way back. You're here because of her, because she reminded me how to live." Grace gurgled, gripping his shirt with her tiny fingers. "And every day," he said, kissing the top of her head, "I thank the stars that I was blind, because if I hadn't been, I might have missed seeing what really matters." Outside, the bell above the bakery door chimed. Life went on, warm, messy, beautiful, and full of the kind of love you only find when you think all is lost and someone decides to stay. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means this journey touched your heart, and I'm truly grateful for your time. What can we learn from Daniel and Emily's story? Life doesn't always go as planned. Sometimes it takes losing everything to truly understand what matters. Pain, loss, and heartbreak are inevitable, but with love, resilience, and the courage to start again, we can build something even more beautiful than what we lost. Never underestimate the power of a second chance, or the quiet strength of someone who chooses to stay when everyone else walks away. Now, I'd love to know, Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. It means the world to me to see how far these stories reach. And if this story moved you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next heartfelt tale. There's so much more to come. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never stop believing in the magic of love and redemption.